Welcome to True Crime, Faith, and Chocolate. I am your host, Dateline, USA Today bestseller of Just One More and a lot of other books. Today's chocolate is, I got this from my daughter after a trip. It's called Hawaiian Host Founders Collection Dark Chocolate Signature Premium Dark Chocolate covered in whole macadamias. I've had one, I've been saving the other. Oh yeah. Here it is. Today I have so much to cover. We'll see if I can get it done in one video. I might spill over into two, we shall see. So as promised, I'm going to do a bit of a catch-up primer review as we lead up to the Chad Daybell trial, which begins April 1st, 2024. And a lot has happened since the whole thing blew up. I have a slightly different perspective on some of it, not only from a faith perspective, but also because I've been in the Latter-day Saint publishing market. I've published pretty consistently for a good 10 years with one of the top two biggest publishers. I had friends who signed on with Chad. I have one friend who actually was rejected by Tammy when they were working at Cedar Fort, which is another publisher. So I remember when I first heard of Tammy's death, it was a shock, and it was before it hit the news, but as I remember very distinctly, I actually said in one forum, I said, you guys, this is starting to feel like a Dateline episode. And a couple people were like, oh, that's rude. Well, look where we are today, guys. So yeah, we'll go into Lori another time. Obviously, there's no way to avoid Lori entirely in the story, but this video is focused primarily on Chad. Huge props to Hidden True Crime with Lauren Mathias and Dr. John Mathias. She is a journalist and he is a forensic psychologist. So they analyze all kinds of true crime and they have been following the Daybell case for a long time. So I'll put a link to not only their channel, but to their Patreon and also to their Daybell playlist. Highly recommend going there. Dr. John has so many fascinating insights, and special thanks to Carrie Knapp, who is one of the Hidden True Crime Patreon members, of which I am as well. She put together a timeline of the Daybell stuff. From about the time Chad and Lori met until basically they were charged. So there's stuff on either end that she doesn't quite cover, but it's very good, very, very helpful, and I used a lot of that in preparing for today's video. Although, again, keep in mind, I am not covering, there's so much more and so many people involved. Every person I mentioned could almost have their own videos. Let me know in the comments if you want me to address anyone or any topic in particular. So Chad was born in Manti, Utah. If you're looking at the map of Utah, it's kind of in the middle and a little bit to the east. It's roughly 125 miles south of Salt Lake City, if that gives you an idea. But he was mostly raised in Springville, which is about 50 miles south of Salt Lake. It is still in Utah County, so it's not really a rural area. When he was there, it was a much smaller town. It was about 8,000 or 9,000 people in about 1970. He was born in 68, so right about the time he lived there. My family actually lived there when I was first born, up to about 4.5. It was a much smaller town than it is today. It's had quite an explosion in the last few years. Right today, it is about 35,000 people. So it's more than quadrupled since Chad was a kid. And most that's probably in the last 20, 25 years. When he was in the 4th grade, so about 9 or 10 years old, this is in his own autobiography. His autobiography, when you go, why are you hearing yourself? This isn't coming across as you probably think it is. But he tells a story of, another one of my sources here is Leah Sotel's in the Daily Beast. She's done several articles for them. This is particularly one that begins actually with this anecdote. So I will link again to her article and to her book as well in the description, so you can go find all of that information. But so Chad tells of walking home from school, 9 or 10 years old, crossing a field, and he sees a bee pollinating a flower. And he just decides to stomp on it and kill it. And he does, and then he feels this surge of power, and he decides to keep killing. And so half an hour later, he has killed 120 bees. Not hornets, not wasps, honeybees who were literally pollinating flowers and not attacking him. He's killing bees. He counted, he said, 120 bees that he killed, and he only stopped when a voice told him to stop. And then I think the reason he tells the story is because I've been following that voice ever since. Okay, so this kind of is some of the first times he starts tiptoeing into the faith end of things with his manipulations, because who doesn't talk about, like, their conscience is speaking to them, like, oh, the Jiminy Cricket on your shoulder, or, they have the angel and the devil or whatever. And yet we don't actually talk about a voice, and I followed that one voice. And so I have a feeling that if he had followed his actual conscience for the rest of his life, if he actually has one, he wouldn't have ended up in the mess he's in today. Just positing that. But yeah, it's also disturbing that he didn't stop because of his conscience. It was an outside voice telling him to stop. It's disturbing to me that he would find pleasure in just killing innocent creatures. Over 100 of them. That's messed up. He apparently even wrote, like, a murder story for his teacher, and, like, again, right around 4th grade, I believe. Now, that would not necessarily be a red flag for everybody. Apparently, it is for him. Very clearly, it's a red flag for Chad Daybell. Being as I write suspense, and I have concocted all kinds of ideas about, murders and death and ways to kill people and how to dispose of bodies and things. My search history is a little disturbing on the one hand, but I'm also not a sociopath, and I'm not a cult leader, and I'm not actually killing anyone. So I think most writers are more like me. But that's kind of how people probably looked at Chad initially. He's always had an obsession with death, and part of that, I think, continued on and was probably exacerbated by his work in a cemetery, which he has done for a good chunk of his life. As a teenager and as a young adult, as he was dating his to-be wife, Tammy, and then even as an adult later on, he was digging graves, he was a sexton, all this kind of stuff. But backing up just a little bit before that, when he was still a teenager, he claims, and now I don't know at what time point he actually told people this story, but he claims, because the timing of when he reveals things seems a little convenient, when he claims that when he was 17 years old, when he was on a trip to Flaming Gorge, he jumps off a cliff. That's a place in here in Utah, and you're no longer allowed to jump off this because people have been hurt and killed doing so. But he jumps off, and he claims that as he hit the water, he felt like he was hitting concrete, which I believe, because water, ouch, especially depending on how you hit it. But he says that he felt like his spirit was leaving his body and got stuck at his skull. And he heard a crack in his skull, and he thought he'd broken his neck or something. But instead, his spirit almost leaves his body, again, stuck at his skull, and he sees into heaven. He sees through the veil, and from that point on, he says that his veil is torn. So in Latter-day Saint lingo and belief, that the veil is significant. It's, the idea is that we lived before this earth, and our spirits are eternal. We had personalities and lives and all that before we came to earth. And then when we came here, there's a veil put over our memories, so we will not remember before. So this life is a true test, kind of thing. And so, but his veil is torn, and he can see to the other side and all that. So that's not convenient. So he goes to college. He attends Brigham Young University in Provo, which, to give you an idea, is just a short drive from Springville, because Springville is in Provo. Sorry. Brigham Young University is in Provo, and then Springville is this town directly south of Provo. So he just goes north a little bit to school. Apparently, he tried to date a girl at BYU who told him, "Oh goodness, you are so sheltered. You need to get out and see the world." And he writes this again in his autobiography. He says, "Well, hey, I've been to Disneyland 3 times. I've been to the Four Corners Monument, where I got to stand in 4 states at once. And I went a mile into Tijuana, Mexico." Now, as he's writing this, you kind of get the sense that maybe as an adult, he's saying this as he's joking. But you have to wonder, as a young college student, if he actually thought that and then was like, "I'm not sheltered." I kind of get the feel that he actually didn't feel like he was sheltered and whatever. So he goes on to serve a mission for his church, and many people are called abroad, and I would have thought that, maybe getting called to someplace outside the United States would have been helpful to him. I don't know that he could have handled it, however, because he was called to New Jersey. And the way he describes it is it was like, oh, this trash, it's like a burning dumpster fire is the way he describes New Jersey, which tells me that, yes, dude, you were very sheltered. I don't think the place was completely trashy, but okay. But he comes home saying that I know the world now because I've been to New Jersey. The world is a very large place, dude, with a lot of people, a lot of cultures, a lot of different kinds of things. You've seen nothing. You've seen this much. Okay, so after his mission, he meets Tammy at a singles activity for his church. So it's singles ward, a ward being a congregation. So as they start dating, Chad's working at the cemetery. She works for the Springville Parks Department, and so when there's like a death notice or something along those lines, she's the one to deliver it on purpose, hoping to see Chad there. And so they date and all of that stuff. They get engaged pretty quickly. Their engagement photos are taken in the cemetery. Creepy in hindsight. Now, I love cemeteries myself, again, because I love history. I love wandering cemeteries and looking at headstones and thinking of the stories of the people, the lives that people lived who were buried there. And he went on to publish and to tell stories at conferences and whatnot about like ghosts he would talk to and tell them to go away. Now, this again goes kind of into our beliefs where we do believe there's a life after this one. We also believe that when you die and your body and your spirit are separated, you go to the spirit world awaiting resurrection, and the spirit world is still here on the earth. It's just in another dimension, essentially. We can't see it. So doesn't completely strain credulity that you could maybe see someone who's passed on if, your veil's torn or whatever. So again, it's like he's tiptoeing into what things that would be possible and not even necessarily off the wall or whatever. But it kind of, again, like it gives him permission to go further and further and further. Okay, so one thing that I found fascinating, this is something from Dr. John Matthias at Hidden True Crime. He believes that Chad, surrounded by death at the cemetery and just in his own life, he is afraid of his own mortality. And that he, as a coping mechanism, he needs to find a way to exert control over his life and kind of, so that's how he kind of develops into I am a prophet, I am a seer, and eventually I am becoming this translated being, I am immortal, as a coping mechanism because he is afraid of death. He's been surrounded by it and he's obsessed with it. And Dr. John also points out that, I believe this is just one of the first two episodes that they do in the Chad Daybell playlist, which again, linked in the description. Listen to it, it's fantastic. But he talks about how he interviews criminals regularly as a part of his job to do reports. And he says it's very common for murderers and other violent criminals, especially certain types of violence, where it's not about the violence, it's about the control. It's not about the passion or the hormonal thing, trying to use safe words here on YouTube, but it's about feeling control. And many perpetrators say they feel powerful in the act of committing various crimes. They feel godlike even. And it's about power. It's not just about the crime. It's about power and control. So that really tracks with the idea that maybe Chad is just feeling scared and out of control, perhaps. After he graduates from BYU, Chad gets a job in Ogden, which is a city about maybe 25 or 40 miles north of Salt Lake City, at the newspaper called the Standard Examiner. And while he is there, the newspaper does an interview with a woman by the name of Betty Eady, who wrote a book called Embraced by the Light about her own near-death experience, and it was incredibly popular. I remember hearing about this book when I was younger, and everybody was reading it, and it was kind of like the first, at least in Utah. I don't know how it was elsewhere, but at least here it was the first real near-death experience type book I remember hearing about and that everybody was kind of obsessed with. And in her case, it happened, I think, as a result of like a hysterectomy surgery or something like that. And she decided to come back and start going to church again and all this kind of thing. And she herself didn't realize how popular her own book had become until she was on her way to give a presentation and got stuck in traffic and was like, what is going on? I'm going to be late. Turns out the traffic jam was where people trying to get to the event to see her. And so she was like 40 minutes late to her own speaking event. She had no idea how popular she had become. But Chad's watching this. And this is just a guess, but he's probably kind of going, there is money to be made off of near-death experiences. Mental note. So, anyway, it's interesting that Chad eventually has another near-death experience. Again, the timing of when he tells people is curious. This is one where his family has like had at least a brother there and some other family, like immediate family. So this wasn't like just like Tammy and their children. This was the family he grew up in. Where it's one thing we don't talk about near-death experiences because they're sacred to you. You only share them with people who are close to you, and that's something that actually in our faith that we do embrace. That is something that's a very sacred experience. You don't just share it with the masses. It's something precious, and you show God that you value it by not just spreading it out there, which is something that both Chad and Lori eventually do. They start talking all about supposedly these experiences that they've had, and their own family is like, you never told us this. Why? It would make sense if you didn't tell us, except maybe privately later, but why are you suddenly telling it to everybody? Why didn't you, if you're willing to talk to about it publicly, why wouldn't you ever tell your family about it? That's odd. So this is jumping ahead timeline-wise, but way ahead. Lori had her podcast with Melanie Gibb. This is before everything exploded. But in that podcast, she is telling stories of supposedly when Jesus Christ himself came to visit her. Again, in our faith, we believe that is possible, rare, but technically possible. And that experience would be called the second comforter, meaning the first comforter, meaning the Holy Ghost, who can be with you always. The second comforter would be a visitation from Christ himself. That is literally not something you would talk about publicly. Maybe like your best friend and a spouse, or a parent might know that, and that would be it. But she's talking about this on a public podcast. And then somehow the near-death experiences become really valuable to both Chad and Lori. That's somehow how you get almost the authority to lead people and see through the veil and all that stuff. So when Lori was actually sentenced in July, she was guilty in May, sentenced in July of 2023. She suddenly brings up the supposed near-death experience when her daughter Tylee was born, and she was out of her body and saw her dead sister, and none of her family has been like, that was the first they've ever heard of it. She had never brought up that near-death experience before, and this is a woman who is sharing anything and everything she can. So I personally think she made that up, because near-death experiences, that gives you clout in their world. So she had to do that, and so she lied about it, in my opinion. In the interest of time, we're going to break it right there. So that's part 1 of 3 for Who is Chad Daybell, the monster? Who is Chad Daybell, the monster murderer? Stay tuned for part 2.